He who cannot endure toil shall not inherit honor. Napoleon Bonaparte. Advantage demands sacrifice, a truth consistently ignored by those who chase immediate gratification. The world is filled with people who prioritize fleeting pleasure over long-term gain, the quick win over sustained dominance. They mistake impulsive action for decisive action, reacting to the surface rather than understanding the underlying currents. This is the fundamental difference between the player and the pawn. One sacrifices to control the board, the other is blindly moved across it. Sacrifice isn't about reckless abandon, it's about calculated exchange. It's about understanding the true cost of victory and being willing to pay it up front, knowing the reward will be exponentially greater in the end. It means delaying satisfaction, enduring discomfort, and foregoing opportunities that appear attractive but ultimately distract from the primary objective. The capacity to sacrifice separates those who dream of success from those who engineer it. It's a mindset, a discipline, a commitment to the long game that most are unwilling or unable to adopt. The path to advantage is paved with sacrifices, large and small, each a conscious decision to forego the easy path for the path that leads to true and lasting power. Most people can't see beyond the immediate loss. They lament the things they give up, blinded to the far greater things they stand to gain. This short-sightedness is their undoing, the anchor that keeps them tethered to mediocrity. The strategic mind, however, embraces sacrifice as a tool, a lever to manipulate the future. It understands that every concession, every act of delayed gratification, is an investment in a future where control is absolute. This understanding is not intuitive. It requires a shift in perspective, a rejection of the prevailing culture of instant gratification and emotional response. It requires the ability to see beyond the immediate, to anticipate the consequences of every action, and to make choices that align with a long-term strategic vision. Advantage is not a gift. It is earned, meticulously planned, and fiercely defended. And it always demands sacrifice. The weak cling to what they have, fearing loss above all else. The strong leverage what they have, risking it all for the chance to command everything. This is the calculus of power, a calculus that separates the rulers from the ruled. Embrace sacrifice, master it, and watch as the world rearranges itself to your advantage. The psychology of sacrifice is the psychology of delayed gratification, a concept so simple to understand, yet so difficult to implement. It's the ability to resist immediate pleasure for a greater reward in the future, a skill that distinguishes those who achieve lasting success from those who remain trapped in a cycle of short-term thinking. The human brain is wired for immediate gratification, a survival mechanism that prioritizes instant needs over long-term goals. Overcoming this innate tendency requires a conscious effort to reprogram the mind, to prioritize strategic thinking over emotional response. This reprogramming begins with understanding the true cost of immediate gratification. Every impulse indulged, every shortcut taken, every comfort embraced comes at a price. That price is often the forfeiture of long-term advantage, the surrender of potential power, the acceptance of a diminished future. The strategic mind recognizes this cost and actively seeks to minimize it. It understands that true satisfaction comes not from instant gratification, but from the achievement of meaningful goals. It derives pleasure not from fleeting moments of comfort, but from the steady accumulation of power and control. This shift in perspective requires a willingness to endure discomfort, to embrace challenges, and to consistently prioritize long-term goals over short-term desires. It requires a mental fortitude that is rare, but essential for those who seek to command their own destiny. The ability to delay gratification is not merely a matter of willpower. It is a skill that can be developed through practice and discipline. It begins with setting clear and ambitious goals, visualizing the future rewards, and breaking down the path to success into manageable steps. Each small act of sacrifice, each instance of delayed gratification, reinforces the neural pathways that support long-term thinking, making it easier to resist temptation in the future. This process is not always easy. There will be setbacks and temptations along the way. But the strategic mind understands that these are merely tests, opportunities to strengthen resolve and reinforce commitment to the long game. Moreover, the psychology of sacrifice extends beyond the individual. It encompasses the ability to make difficult decisions for the benefit of a larger group, organization, or even a nation. This requires a level of empathy and foresight that is even rarer than the ability to delay personal gratification. The strategic leader must be able to see beyond their own immediate interests and consider the needs of those they serve. They must be willing to make sacrifices, not just for themselves, but for the greater good. This often means making unpopular decisions, enduring criticism, and bearing the weight of responsibility for the well-being of others. The rewards for this type of sacrifice are not always immediate or tangible. They may come in the form of a stronger, more resilient organization, a more prosperous society, or a more secure future for generations to come. But the strategic leader understands that these rewards are far more valuable than any personal gain. They are the foundation upon which true and lasting power is built. The strategic mind is also adept at framing sacrifice in a positive light. Instead of viewing it as a loss, it is seen as an investment, a calculated risk taken to achieve a greater return. This reframing helps to mitigate the emotional discomfort associated with sacrifice and makes it easier to embrace the long-term perspective. For example, instead of viewing the time spent studying as a sacrifice of leisure, it is seen as an investment in future career opportunities. Instead of viewing the financial sacrifices required to start a business as a loss of immediate spending power, it is seen as an investment in future financial independence. This positive framing allows the strategic mind to approach sacrifice with a sense of optimism and purpose, rather than resentment and fear. Ultimately, the psychology of sacrifice is about controlling your impulses and directing them towards the accomplishment of long-term goals. It's about trading small comforts for big achievements and embracing the temporary pain that comes with giving up something now for the greater good that will follow. Consider the story of the Medici family in Renaissance Florence. Their rise to power wasn't accidental. It was meticulously planned, a centuries-long game of strategic positioning and calculated risk. They understood that true advantage demands sacrifice, and they were willing to make those sacrifices, not just for themselves, but for the long-term prosperity of their family and their city. Cosimo de' Medici, in particular, embodies this principle. He recognized that controlling Florence required more than just wealth. It demanded influence, and influence was built on perceived legitimacy and public goodwill. Instead of hoarding his immense fortune, he poured vast sums into public works, commissioning artists like Donatello and Brunelleschi to create magnificent buildings and artworks that would beautify the city and enhance its reputation. These acts of patronage weren't simply acts of generosity. They were strategic investments. They solidified the Medici's image as benevolent rulers, cultivated loyalty among the populace, and attracted talent and commerce to Florence, further bolstering the city's wealth and power. This was a clear example of sacrificing immediate gains for long-term strategic advantage. Cosimo could have used his wealth to amass more power for himself, to build a private army, or to live a life of unimaginable luxury. But he understood that such actions would have been short-sighted. They would have alienated the people, provoked resentment from rival families, and ultimately jeopardized the Medici's long-term security. Instead, he chose to sacrifice immediate gratification and personal gain for the greater good of Florence, knowing that this would ultimately benefit the Medici family in the long run. This approach permeated all levels of Medici power. Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's grandson, continued this tradition of strategic sacrifice. He understood that Florence's cultural dominance was a key source of its power. So, he actively fostered the arts and sciences, attracting some of the greatest minds of the Renaissance to Florence. He established libraries, supported scholars, and commissioned countless works of art. This commitment to culture was not merely an aesthetic preference. It was a calculated strategy to enhance Florence's prestige and influence. It made Florence a magnet for talent, ideas, and innovation, which in turn fueled its economic and political power. He understood that intellectual capital was as valuable as financial capital, and he invested heavily in both. This required sacrifices. The Medici family could have used their wealth for other purposes, such as military expansion or political maneuvering, but they recognized that investing in culture would yield a greater return in the long run. It would create a more vibrant and dynamic society, attract more skilled workers and entrepreneurs, and enhance Florence's reputation as a center of learning and innovation. This commitment to culture also helped to legitimize the Medici's rule. By associating themselves with the arts and sciences, they positioned themselves as patrons of progress and enlightenment, which made them more popular with the people and less vulnerable to criticism from their rivals. In short, the Medici family understood that true power is not just about wealth and military might. It's about influence, prestige, and the ability to shape the narrative. And they were willing to sacrifice immediate gains to achieve these long-term strategic objectives. The modern parallels are clear. The Medici story highlights a crucial element of strategic thinking, the ability to see beyond the immediate horizon and understand the long-term consequences of your actions. It's about resisting the temptation to prioritize short-term gains at the expense of long-term goals. It requires a deep understanding of human psychology, the dynamics of power, and the importance of perception. It also requires a willingness to make difficult choices, to sacrifice personal interests for the greater good, and to embrace the uncertainty that comes with taking calculated risks. The Medicis were willing to reinvest their assets in the city-state, sacrificing comforts now for long-term appreciation of the entire system and their role within it. That is what separates short-sighted greed from strategic mastery. The key lesson is this: true advantage is rarely achieved through impulsive actions or selfish pursuits. It requires careful planning, calculated risk-taking, and a willingness to sacrifice for the long-term benefit of yourself and the larger system around you. It is this understanding that separates those who merely react to events from those who shape them. Those who react lose. The inability to delay gratification is a weakness exploited by those who understand the long game. They set traps, knowing the impulsive will always take the bait. These traps aren't always obvious. They often appear as opportunities, shortcuts to success, or instant gratification. Think of the person who falls for a get-rich-quick scheme, blinded by the promise of easy money and unwilling to put in the hard work and dedication required for genuine success. Or consider the politician who makes short-sighted decisions to win immediate popularity, sacrificing the long-term interests of their constituents for personal gain. The common thread is a lack of foresight, an inability to see beyond the immediate reward and anticipate the long-term consequences. This is the essence of the trap, the allure of instant gratification masking a path to long-term failure. The weak are easily manipulated because their desires control them, not the other way around. They crave immediate validation, instant results, and easy solutions. This makes them vulnerable to those who offer false promises and empty gestures. A strategic mind understands that true success requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to endure short-term discomfort for long-term gain. It's about recognizing that every decision has consequences, and that impulsive actions often lead to unintended and undesirable outcomes. This requires a deep understanding of your own weaknesses and biases, as well as the motivations and strategies of those around you. The trap is often baited with ego, flattery, recognition, the illusion of being special or chosen. These are the tools used to cloud judgment and manipulate behavior. The strategic player sees through this facade, recognizing that true strength lies not in seeking validation from others, but in building a solid foundation of knowledge, skill, and resilience. They understand that true power comes from within, from the ability to control their own emotions and actions, and from a commitment to long-term goals that transcend the fleeting pleasures of the moment. The trap works because it exploits our inherent human desire for recognition and belonging. We all want to feel valued and appreciated, but the weak seek this validation from external sources, making them susceptible to manipulation. Consider the chess player who sacrifices a pawn early in the game, not for immediate material gain, but to control the center of the board and gain a positional advantage. This is a calculated sacrifice, a short-term loss that leads to a long-term gain. The weaker player, focused only on immediate material value, might see this as a mistake and attempt to exploit it, falling directly into the trap. They fail to see the bigger picture, the long-term strategic implications of the sacrifice. Similarly, in business, a company might invest heavily in research and development, sacrificing short-term profits for the potential of long-term innovation and market dominance. This requires a willingness to delay gratification, to see beyond the immediate bottom line and anticipate the future needs of the market. The trap is not just about individual failures. It can also apply to entire organizations and societies. A nation that prioritizes short-term economic growth at the expense of environmental sustainability is falling into a trap, sacrificing the long-term health of the planet for immediate gains. A company that cuts corners on quality to increase profits is sacrificing its long-term reputation and customer loyalty. In each case, the pursuit of immediate gratification leads to long-term consequences that undermine the very goals that were initially sought. To avoid the trap, one must cultivate a long-term perspective, a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of events, and a willingness to make difficult choices that prioritize long-term stability and sustainability over short-term gains. It requires a constant awareness of the potential for manipulation and a commitment to acting in accordance with one's own values and principles, rather than succumbing to the pressures of the moment. The Machiavellian approach embraces the concept of calculated sacrifice as a cornerstone of effective strategy. It acknowledges that achieving significant long-term advantage often necessitates making difficult choices, enduring short-term losses, and foregoing immediate rewards. This is not to be confused with reckless gambling or impulsive risk-taking, but rather a carefully considered evaluation of potential outcomes, where the value of the ultimate prize far outweighs the immediate cost. It requires a certain detachment from emotional impulses, a willingness to act against conventional wisdom, and a clear understanding of the motivations and vulnerabilities of others. The effective strategist must be able to anticipate the reactions of their opponents, to use their weaknesses against them, and to exploit opportunities that others overlook. The Machiavellian mindset recognizes that power is not simply given, but must be actively pursued and maintained. This often involves making unpopular decisions, engaging in strategic deception, and even resorting to actions that might be considered morally questionable by some. However, the Machiavellian strategist would argue that these actions are justified if they serve a greater purpose, such as the preservation of the state, the advancement of a cause, or the achievement of a long-term goal. The ability to make sacrifices is not merely a matter of willpower or discipline. It also requires a deep understanding of human psychology. People are often driven by short-term desires, fears, and insecurities. The skilled strategist can exploit these weaknesses to their advantage, using them to manipulate others, to create distractions, and to sow discord. For example, a political leader might use fear to rally support for a particular policy, or a business competitor might spread rumors to undermine their rival's reputation. These tactics may be ethically questionable, but they can be highly effective in achieving specific goals. The Machiavellian approach emphasizes the importance of understanding the motivations of others and using that knowledge to influence their behavior. It requires a keen awareness of human nature, a willingness to exploit weaknesses, and a capacity for strategic deception. This is not to say that the Machiavellian strategist is inherently immoral, but rather that they are willing to set aside ethical considerations when necessary to achieve their objectives. The focus is always on the outcome, and the means are justified by the ends. Furthermore, the Machiavellian strategist understands that sacrifice is not a one-time event, but rather an ongoing process. It requires constant vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to adjust one's strategy in response to changing circumstances. There will be setbacks and failures along the way, but the key is to learn from these experiences and to continue moving forward, even in the face of adversity. The ability to persevere through difficult times, to maintain focus on the long-term goal, and to adapt to changing circumstances is essential for success. The Machiavellian approach emphasizes the importance of resilience, adaptability, and a relentless pursuit of one's objectives. It requires a willingness to learn from mistakes, to adjust one's strategy as needed, and to never give up, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles. This is not a path for the faint of heart, but it is a path that can lead to extraordinary achievements. The concept of strategic sacrifice extends beyond individual actions to encompass the broader dynamics of social and political systems. In the context of international relations, for example, a nation might choose to sacrifice short-term economic gains to forge alliances with other countries, strengthening its long-term security and influence. This could involve providing financial aid, sharing technological expertise, or even committing military resources to support a common cause. The decision to make these sacrifices is not based on altruism, but rather on a calculated assessment of the long-term benefits that will accrue to the nation as a result of its actions. Similarly, in the realm of social movements, activists might choose to engage in civil disobedience, risking arrest and imprisonment to raise awareness of their cause and to pressure authorities to implement change. This is a form of strategic sacrifice, where individuals are willing to endure personal hardship to advance a larger social or political agenda. The Machiavellian perspective recognizes that such sacrifices are often necessary to achieve meaningful change, and that those who are unwilling to make them are unlikely to succeed in their efforts. Ultimately, the Machiavellian approach to advantage through sacrifice is about understanding the complex interplay of power, strategy, and human behavior. It requires a willingness to make difficult choices, to act against conventional wisdom, and to prioritize long-term goals over short-term gratification. It is not a philosophy for the faint of heart, but it is a philosophy that can be highly effective in achieving success in a competitive and often ruthless world. The strategist must always be aware of the potential for manipulation and deception, and must be prepared to use these tactics themselves when necessary. The focus is always on the outcome, and the means are justified by the ends. This is not to say that ethical considerations are irrelevant, but rather that they must be weighed against the strategic imperatives of the situation. The Machiavellian approach is about achieving results, and it is about doing whatever it takes to win. It acknowledges that the world is not always fair, and that those who are unwilling to play by the rules are likely to be left behind. The Roman Empire, a vast and enduring power, provides a compelling historical parallel to the principle that advantage demands sacrifice. The expansion and maintenance of Roman dominance was not achieved through brute force alone, but through a calculated series of strategic sacrifices made by both individuals and the state. Consider the legions, the backbone of Roman military might. These were not simply armies. They were highly disciplined and rigorously trained fighting forces, built on the backs of citizen soldiers who were willing to leave their homes, their farms, and their families to serve for years on end. This commitment represented a significant sacrifice, both personally and economically, yet it was this very dedication that allowed Rome to project its power across continents. The Punic Wars, a series of brutal conflicts against Carthage, exemplify this principle further. Rome endured devastating defeats, crippling losses, and near annihilation, yet it refused to yield. The sacrifices made in terms of manpower, resources, and economic stability were immense, but they were ultimately deemed necessary to eliminate a rival that threatened Rome's very existence. This long-term strategic vision, a willingness to endure short-term pain for long-term gain, was a hallmark of Roman policy. Even within Roman society, the concept of sacrifice was deeply ingrained. The patrician class, the elite ruling families, were expected to contribute vast sums of money to public works, to sponsor gladiatorial games, and to fund military campaigns. This was a form of civic duty, a recognition that their privileged position came with the responsibility to sacrifice for the greater good of the state. Of course, this system was not without its flaws and inequities. The burden of sacrifice often fell disproportionately on the lower classes, and the pursuit of power could lead to corruption and tyranny. However, the underlying principle remained that the attainment and preservation of advantage required a willingness to sacrifice, to endure hardship, and to prioritize the collective good over individual gain. The willingness to commit to these sacrifices allowed the empire to maintain its position, but the cost of not recognizing the changing needs of the people contributed to the decay of the empire and eventually its fall. The strategic implications are clear. Advantage requires sacrifice, but sacrifice without a clear strategy is a waste. The psychology of sacrifice is complex, a battlefield waged within the individual mind long before it manifests in any tangible action. It's not merely about giving something up, but about the internal calculus, the agonizing trade-offs that precede the decision. A chess player sacrificing a pawn understands the move is not a loss, but an investment. It's a calculated depletion of resources designed to create a more advantageous position down the line. But what happens when the sacrifice isn't so clear-cut? What happens when the potential payoff is obscured by uncertainty, when the immediate pain is far more palpable than the promised future reward? This is where the mental fortitude of a true strategist is tested. They must possess the ability to override the emotional impulses that scream for self-preservation, the primal instincts that recoil from loss. This requires a disciplined mind, one capable of detaching itself from the immediate discomfort and projecting forward, envisioning the altered landscape after the sacrifice has been made. This ability to visualize the future outcome is crucial. It's the fuel that sustains the will to persevere through the period of deprivation, the anchor that prevents the individual from succumbing to despair. It's a delicate balancing act, a constant weighing of potential gains against present costs. And it's not a purely rational process. Emotion plays a crucial role, albeit a carefully managed one. The strategist must cultivate a sense of conviction, a deep belief in the ultimate value of the goal. This belief acts as a buffer against doubt, a source of inner strength when the path forward seems bleak. Without this emotional commitment, the sacrifices become meaningless, acts of self-harm rather than strategic investments. The psychology of sacrifice is further complicated by the social context in which it occurs. Individuals rarely operate in a vacuum. Their decisions are influenced by the expectations of others, by the norms and values of their society. In a collectivist culture, sacrifice for the common good may be seen as a virtue, a sign of loyalty and commitment. In an individualistic culture, it may be viewed with suspicion, as a form of self-denial or even weakness. Understanding these cultural dynamics is essential for any leader who seeks to inspire sacrifice in their followers. They must be able to articulate a compelling vision of the future, one that resonates with the values of the group and demonstrates the necessity of the sacrifices being asked. Furthermore, trust is paramount. People are far more likely to make sacrifices for a leader they believe to be competent, honest, and acting in their best interests. If trust is eroded, the willingness to sacrifice evaporates, replaced by cynicism and resentment. The long game demands an understanding of human nature, of the intricate interplay between reason and emotion, between individual needs and collective goals. And it demands a recognition that true advantage is not merely about accumulating resources, but about cultivating the mental fortitude and social cohesion necessary to endure the inevitable sacrifices along the way. The ability to endure sacrifice, to delay gratification for a future reward, is a cornerstone of strategic thinking. It distinguishes those who play the long game from those who are trapped in the present moment. It allows for calculated risks, for bold gambits that may appear foolish in the short term but can yield enormous dividends in the long run. But the capacity for sacrifice is not unlimited. It's a finite resource that must be carefully managed. Overuse can lead to burnout, resentment, and ultimately, a breakdown of the system. A wise leader understands this and strives to minimize the necessary sacrifices, to find creative solutions that allow for progress without undue hardship. They recognize that the most sustainable advantage is not built on the backs of the exploited, but on the collective effort of a motivated and engaged population. The mental burden of sacrifice extends beyond the immediate act. The individual must also cope with the consequences of their decision, with the potential for regret, doubt, and even anger. This requires resilience, the ability to bounce back from setbacks and to learn from mistakes. It also requires a willingness to adapt, to adjust the strategy as new information becomes available. Rigidity in the face of changing circumstances is a recipe for disaster. The sacrifices of the past may become irrelevant, even counterproductive, if they are not continually reevaluated in light of the present reality. True strategic thinking demands a constant cycle of planning, action, and reflection, a continuous process of learning and adaptation. The ruthless pursuit of advantage, particularly in the world of business, often demands a willingness to make sacrifices that extend beyond the purely financial. Consider the case of a tech startup that, in its early stages, promises its employees equity in the company, alongside salaries that are significantly below market value. This proposition, pitched as an investment in future success, is inherently a call for sacrifice. Employees are asked to forego immediate financial security, to work long hours under intense pressure, all in the hope of a substantial payoff should the company achieve its ambitious goals. The founder, driven by a vision and fueled by ambition, may genuinely believe in the company's potential and the eventual rewards for those who endure the early struggles. However, the reality is that the vast majority of startups fail. The sacrifices made by the employees, the years of dedication and underpayment, may ultimately amount to nothing. The promised equity becomes worthless, and the individuals are left with only the experience, the scars of a demanding environment, and perhaps a lingering sense of disillusionment. The advantage gained by the company in this scenario is clear: a highly motivated and underpaid workforce, willing to push the boundaries of innovation in pursuit of a shared dream. But this advantage comes at a cost borne disproportionately by those who are least able to afford it. The ethical implications of such a strategy are complex. Is it fair to ask individuals to gamble their financial well-being on a long-shot venture? Does the potential for reward justify the inherent risk? The answer, of course, depends on the specific circumstances, the transparency of the communication, and the genuine belief of the leadership in the company's mission. But even with the best intentions, the pressure to succeed, to outmaneuver competitors, can lead to decisions that prioritize the collective advantage over the individual welfare. This is the nature of competitive landscapes. The inherent imbalance in the power dynamic between employer and employee can further exacerbate the situation. The employees, particularly in the early stages of a startup, may feel compelled to accept the terms offered, fearing that they will be passed over for other opportunities if they push for better compensation or working conditions. This fear, this sense of vulnerability, can be a powerful motivator, driving them to make sacrifices that they might otherwise resist. The startup environment often fosters a culture of relentless dedication, where long hours and unwavering commitment are seen as badges of honor. Those who prioritize their personal lives or express concerns about burnout may be viewed as lacking the necessary drive and passion, potentially jeopardizing their career prospects. This pressure to conform, to embrace the culture of sacrifice, can create a self-perpetuating cycle where individuals are incentivized to push themselves beyond their limits, often to the detriment of their mental and physical health. The long-term consequences of such a strategy can be significant, not only for the individuals involved but also for the company itself. Burnout, resentment, and high employee turnover can erode morale, stifle creativity, and ultimately undermine the company's ability to achieve its goals. A more sustainable approach is to create a culture of mutual respect and shared ownership, where employees feel valued and supported, where their contributions are recognized and rewarded, and where sacrifices are minimized and fairly distributed. This requires a shift in mindset, from a focus on short-term gains to a long-term vision of sustainable success, where the welfare of the individual is seen as integral to the overall prosperity of the organization. The true test of a strategic leader is their ability to navigate these complex ethical considerations, to balance the pursuit of advantage with the responsibility to protect the well-being of their team. The trap lies in mistaking activity for achievement. It is easy to fall prey to the illusion that constant motion equates to progress, that busyness is a substitute for effectiveness. Those who lack a clear strategic vision often compensate with frenetic energy, flitting from task to task without a cohesive plan. This approach is ultimately unsustainable, as it leads to wasted effort, diminished returns, and a pervasive sense of frustration. The weak are often seduced by the allure of immediate gratification, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term objectives. They are easily distracted by shiny objects, chasing after fleeting opportunities without considering the broader implications of their actions. This reactive approach leaves them vulnerable to manipulation, as they become pawns in a larger game they do not understand. True advantage requires a different mindset, one that is focused on calculated risks and strategic positioning. It demands the discipline to resist impulsive actions and the foresight to anticipate future challenges. The ability to delay gratification, to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term security, is a hallmark of strategic thinkers. They understand that true success is not a sprint but a marathon, and that pacing themselves accordingly is essential to reaching their destination. The weak often overestimate their own abilities and underestimate the competition. They are blinded by ego, believing that their inherent talents will be enough to overcome any obstacle. This hubris leads to complacency, a dangerous state in which they fail to adapt to changing circumstances. In contrast, strong strategists are acutely aware of their limitations. They understand that success is a collaborative effort, and they surround themselves with talented individuals who complement their own skills. They are constantly learning and adapting, seeking out new information and perspectives to refine their strategies. The weak often confuse luck with skill, attributing their successes to chance rather than to careful planning and execution. This mindset prevents them from learning from their mistakes, as they fail to recognize the underlying causes of their failures. In contrast, strong strategists embrace failure as a learning opportunity. They analyze their mistakes objectively, identifying the factors that contributed to their downfall and adjusting their strategies accordingly. The ability to learn from failure is essential to long-term success, as it allows them to refine their approach and avoid repeating the same mistakes in the future. The trap is sprung when the sacrifice becomes an end in itself, when the pursuit of advantage overshadows all other considerations. A truly strategic approach recognizes the importance of balance, of maintaining a healthy equilibrium between ambition and well-being. The strategic mind understands that every advantage extracted demands a corresponding sacrifice, a calculated concession in one area to achieve dominance in another. This is not merely a transaction, but a fundamental principle of resource allocation. To accumulate power, one must relinquish something of value. To seize opportunity, one must forsake alternative paths. To achieve singular focus, one must filter out distractions and resist the allure of tangential pursuits. It is a ruthless accounting, a constant balancing of debits and credits, where every gain is offset by an inevitable loss. Those who refuse to acknowledge this principle are doomed to chase illusions of effortless victory. They imagine a world where limitless resources are available, where every ambition can be fulfilled without consequence. Such fantasies are the refuge of the naive, the comfort zone of those unwilling to confront the harsh realities of competition. The strategic player sees the board clearly, recognizing the inherent limitations of their position. They understand that every move carries a cost, every decision creates constraints. They do not seek to avoid these constraints, but to leverage them, to transform limitations into strategic assets. They choose their sacrifices wisely, selecting the areas where they can afford to concede ground in order to gain decisive advantages elsewhere. They understand that the map is not the territory, that the representation of a game is not the game itself. This is not a surrender, but a calculated investment. It is a willingness to trade short-term comfort for long-term gain, to endure temporary setbacks in pursuit of ultimate triumph. The cost of advantage is not always immediate or obvious. It may manifest as missed opportunities, strained relationships, or diminished personal fulfillment. The relentless pursuit of strategic goals can consume one's time, energy, and attention, leaving little room for other aspects of life. It requires a willingness to prioritize ambition above all else, to sacrifice personal well-being for the sake of achieving victory. The strategic mind must be prepared to make difficult choices, to sever ties with those who hinder their progress, to forego pleasures that distract from their objectives. This is not to say that the strategic life is devoid of joy or fulfillment. Rather, it is a recognition that true satisfaction comes from achieving meaningful goals, from pushing oneself to the limits of one's capabilities, from leaving a lasting mark on the world. The strategic player finds pleasure in the process of strategizing, in the intellectual challenge of outmaneuvering their opponents, in the satisfaction of seeing their plans come to fruition. However, this satisfaction is contingent upon success. Failure brings not only disappointment, but also the realization that the sacrifices made were in vain. The strategic player must be prepared to accept this risk, to embrace the possibility of failure as an inherent part of the game. They must learn to analyze their mistakes, to extract valuable lessons from their defeats, and to use this knowledge to refine their strategies for the future. This cycle of adaptation is essential to long-term success, as it allows them to stay ahead of the competition and to continuously improve their performance. This often means severing ties, burning bridges, and walking away from commitments that no longer serve the ultimate objective. It's a cold calculation, devoid of sentimentality, where relationships and emotions are weighed against the potential for strategic gain. Those who cling to outdated loyalties or emotional attachments are destined to be left behind. The danger arises when the pursuit of advantage becomes an obsession, when the strategic mind loses sight of the human element. Strategy is not an end in itself, but a tool to be used in the service of larger goals. When strategy becomes divorced from purpose, it can lead to ruthless and destructive behavior. The strategic player must always be mindful of the ethical implications of their actions, to ensure that their pursuit of advantage does not come at the expense of others. This requires a delicate balance, a constant weighing of costs and benefits, a willingness to compromise when necessary. The strategic mind must be both calculating and compassionate, both ruthless and empathetic. They must understand that true strength lies not in domination but in collaboration, that the most sustainable advantages are those that benefit all parties involved. The strategic mindset is not about winning at all costs. It's about understanding the costs, internalizing them, and then choosing to pay them anyway, knowing that the ultimate reward outweighs the immediate sacrifice. It is about playing the long game, where momentary setbacks are merely stepping stones on the path to enduring success. It is about cultivating resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity, to learn from failures, and to emerge stronger from every challenge. The willingness to accept losses, to make sacrifices, and to endure hardship are essential qualities for anyone seeking to achieve strategic mastery. The strategic advantage is not just a position, it's a